we circle back to the emergency management position again?
Okay?
The $70,000 line item here, that's salary only?
Correct.
Budget's now for Benny's 20, 25?
We have money in the benefit line for this position. When we put it in, we put the line in, we added the benefits as well.
But that's generally what it falls out at, about 20K?
No, it would be a little higher because we would budget as a family, so it'd be closer to 30.
Okay. So, you know, I share George's concern with paying people to sit around and not be totally productive. I don't doubt that a guy or a gal could come in here and be very busy at this for a couple years. But the reality is, when you stretch this out over a decade, we're gonna spend $1 million on somebody that may not even face a tornado or a flood or a hurricane.
Or coronavirus.
Or the coronavirus, and that's a good point. I mean, we have gotten a lot of emails from Scott over the last 2 weeks regarding this, and what has the town done with those? I mean, what are the action items?
Well, I think part of the problem is that Scott can't do much else. This isn't his full-time position, and I think that the same thing that I said at the meeting, and I'll continue to say, is that I think a lot of the times we talk about this, we talk about it in the sense of, you know, natural disasters. There are other issues that will come up under this role that should be taken care of and addressed. And, you know, I give credit to Rob LeBon. I think he really said it best. You know, you pay for an insurance policy and maybe it doesn't do anything for you for a while, but when it does, you do need it, it's invaluable. And that's what I see in this position.
So,
Mike?
The question, you know, that when Scott first made this presentation, before Emily had joined us even, you know, when we were first talking about this role, it was like in August, September maybe. I think there was general consensus that the concept made sense. But there was discussion around a shared role, you know, a shared position. And I'm, you know, I listened again to that because this was part of that same day that I wasn't here. I listened again. I still don't get a sense that there was any meaningful exploration into looking at that option of a, you know, a shared service, you know, that's a little bit more regional with some of our surrounding towns, which was something that when Scott presented to us, he thought was worth exploring. You know, I have a lot of respect for, you know, Scott, and I think we've all said how fortunate we are to have him, you know, as a resident who volunteers for us. But I was surprised that at least there hasn't been enough information shared with us about that exploration, if it did happen.
I disagree. I think in the conversation, and I don't know if this
Because
just
I
didn't come through, but I mean, Scott shared with us that they had looked into this, and I think that the problem is that God forbid something was to happen, then your emergency management director is going to be pulled into all sorts of different towns or roles, or everyone's going to want their piece of the pie. And, you know, if we look at this, you know, if God forbid it is another tornado or whatever the case may be, we're going to want our emergency management director here full-time working for Southbury, not be bopping around every different community that they might be regionally working for.
I totally agree with that. The only time you could share is during the planning phase, which is most of the time. I mean, most of the time you're not experiencing a disaster, you're planning for one. And it just so happened that I was at Middlebury's town hall today, and my friend Ed St. John, and we had a fairly long discussion about a number of items. I was there primarily looking for data on Edgewood. Wasn't there to talk to Ed St. John about anything, but I happened to run into him. And we talked about the possibility of Park and Rec, a combo effort there. We did talk about this a little bit, the EMD, but we didn't get into any specifics. But I think he might be open to a discussion from my sense of it.
Yeah, and my point there are plenty of places around the country. When we had these discussions, I love trying to learn and do homework, and you know, there are plenty of places around the country with much larger geographic regions than us that are one region that have one person, you know, doing it. I'm not suggesting we do it like a big giant regional one, but it is, most of the time is in the coordination. And as long as that plan is put in place, they're not necessarily being pulled in different directions on the day of, or God forbid, that moment in time when you need to activate that plan, because they've spent the time coordinating the plan, and everybody knows what they're supposed to do when it happens. There's a central emergency operations center for the geographic region that's been defined. So I, you know, I go back to the conversation we had on the police, but then come back to this, and I have a hard time aligning those two, in terms of, just rationale, in terms of when and where we are choosing to, what we are choosing to prioritize, and when, you know, just because I do think whether it be with Middlebury or whether it be with Woodbury, wherever it might be, there's an opportunity for coordination.
So when you talk about the cost, Justin, you talked about how much did you figure over 10 years?
If it's $100,000 a year, that's $1 million.
So we went through the tornado under the guidance of a very good emergency management director. And I remember one of the things that came up was Scott Furr said, I think it was in 5 days or so, I don't exactly remember, I think that was the date or whatever. He addressed the board and said, you're no longer in an emergency, you're in recovery. And he said, you know, you can return to your public works and the call-ins on Saturday, you can return to your regular work. And we did, we cut it off. I think they had people coming Saturday, so we said, okay, we'll work this Saturday, it's already scheduled, overtime, and we stopped. So there was, through his guidance, we had clear delineation of when we were in emergency and when we stopped. Then we started the recovery effort, and quite frankly, it was politically difficult to make that decision to stop the public works from going around the town, and everybody was upset, rightfully so. But we were curb to curb, and that's what we were going to work with. A lot of the recovery of the was it 1.75 million, Betsy? We recovered 1.75 million because we did what we did at the right time under his direction. We documented every piece of paper, every data point. There are still towns, and I believe Newtown, it was expressed to me, that Newtown has not recovered their money. I think their application was $2 million so far. We have gotten the 1.75, 1.1 back, $1.1 million back, because we had an emergency management director who was properly running it. If you look at it from that standpoint, the recovery of that much money is covering this position for 10 years. You also look at the planning that Scott's been doing so far with the schools and what I have been seeing and with the nursing homes and now the coronavirus as this moves forward. You know, it's you don't see it directly. So that's how I came to the decision of a full-time, and it's very difficult to get part-time. I see no movement towards regionalization or a COG-related full-time emergency management director, because I don't know even full-time to do all the COG groups would be very difficult.
Yeah, I think you sort of are making the point, in my opinion, just because Scott did this not as a full-time employee. He has a full-time job in the private sector. That was, he did all this, and he's been tremendous, and helped us with planning, and helped, and not only helped us get through the tornado, but has helped us with a lot of other things in terms of planning. He did this on a part-time basis. And he probably put in more hours than any of us know, by the way, don't get me wrong. But he did it, he has a full-time private sector gig where he's traveling all over the world, right? We all know that. And to me, the point is we're not suggesting that a position that's shared would be part-time. What we're suggesting is that it would be a coordinated shared person who's full-time, so we're sharing the cost of $100,000 or whatever it may be, over the period, rather than on an annual basis, rather than incurring ourselves. But
But I think Scott made that point when he talked last week, and he was, Scott has the flexibility with his job to spend some more time on this, right? But he's saying he's putting in 30 hours a week as it is right now, where he can afford to do that, and there's still more work to be done. I mean, that's a full-time position.
Well, he said 5 to 30 hours a week.
Right, I think some of it is dependent on when he does have to
Work.
travel and work, right? Those are probably those 5-hour weeks from my understanding and conversations with him, and,
So putting the money aside, the, you know, the 75,000, to me, it's very important to have this function. I've advocated since the day Barry was no longer the Emergency Management Director. You know, I've spoken to you and advocated for the fact that we need an Emergency Management Director. Last year, when these discussions were happening, I said repeatedly, we need to hire a part-time Emergency Management Director right now, so that we at least have something in place to build upon. So that's why I put the money discussion aside. I come from the place that this is an important function we need it. I have a concern when you talk about a full-time position because of the point. One of the arguments for the full-time position that I heard from Scott, and I asked him about this at the meeting, was that, you know, he's a volunteer. If he was, you know, doing his other job when the tornado hit, you know, we wouldn't have had anybody here. And that's exactly true if you just have one full-time position running your emergency management department. If that guy's on vacation or something else or ill or, you know, stuck or whatever, you don't have anybody. So that concern, forget about the dollars, is a concern to me where I think, you know, you need more of a structure. So when you talk about a shared position with other towns, like I would envision, like shared on the planning side, and that's something we talked about like 6-7 months ago, George, and I had expected some more analysis and looking into that. But on top of that, also taking like the fire marshal and making and merging positions like it was before, you know, adding, you know, as John Michaels asked about at our meeting last week, you know, I just mentioned fire marshal, some position in town adding duties, extra duties, so you have more people involved in the function on a part-time, limited basis that are doing specific tasks. And when an emergency hits, everybody's full-time. Okay, you know, the week of the tornado, you know, it doesn't matter if your job is 5 hours a week, or like you're full-time and you're going to be getting paid for full-time and whatnot during that time period. But I don't know that I got a good answer to the question of why it's not better to sort of spread it around a little bit, to have more than one person in charge of the function.
So what Scott Furr had talked about, that most of this job, that emergency management director is the planning, the plans, and execution. And that there should be people who, like a fire marshal, or like a volunteer, or people who can run the emergency management, should that person not be in town on vacation or out sick during that emergency. That there should be, what we've learned is the staffing that day of the EOC, I don't want to say it's secondary to the plan. Once, you know, the plans are the tabletop exercises that Scott's been doing with the schools, and working with the region, and working with the nursing homes, and working with the health department. And there's a lot of plans that, you know, and from time, they've got to be updated from time to time. The problem, again, with the discussion about the fire marshal, should there be an emergency, is that the fire marshal has duties that they have to tend to during that emergency. The same discussion of when a police officer was to be a emergency management director. During that emergency, the police officer has duties that have to be performed because you're looking for everybody to be working. That is what I recall the discussion with Scott. Mike?
But, you know, the opportunity could potentially lie in having two people, if we're sharing this, where you can have a, you know, a director, and you can have an assistant or an associate director at a lower cost, you know, and they're coordinating their schedules, and they're working together on developing a plan, and they're never taking a vacation or getting sick at the same time. You know, I think that, you know, and if you're sharing it, you can be responsible with your budget, you know, and have the kind of coverage that begins putting in a more meaningful infrastructure for, you know, for this role. Because I think you're right. I think we all agreed back in, you know, seven months ago that we wanted to fill this. Scott gave a really good presentation. We talked about getting someone in immediately, sort of the stopgap, and then as we got into budget season. But that was the time we also talked about this idea, and I just don't think, you know, there hasn't been much else presented to us to show that there, you know, that what are the options that were looked at. But I share Jason's concern about this. You know, we got lucky Scott was in town. We did, because you do need, and it is in the planning, I think a big part of that is planning, but you still also need someone on point. And you need someone who's, you know, conducting the orchestra when that happens, and that's important. And the plan helps if that person's not there, because that's part of the contingency, what if I'm out of town? But I think that there's a better way, frankly, to use our taxpayer money to provide a better level of potential service in the worst case scenario that, you know, our town potentially face.
Cindy, you had input to this?
So, I think since the time you had your last meetings and now, it might be important is COG is starting to put the regional share, to your point, services back together as a committee. I attended on behalf of the town. And one of the topics that came up, and it was multiple positions, not just this one, where they're finding that's more successful is one town, in this case, we would advocate, or because it's in the budget, that we would hire the emergency management director. There's other positions that it's working successfully. And then what happens is other towns who can use something, and in this case it would be to develop their plans because other people are volunteers, that we recoup part of that cost by sharing it and sort of sending it out. So, and I think, George, that you went to a meeting that they sort of advocated the same, right?
Yeah, I spoke with
And so I
the Region
think,
5 director.
anyhow, that's what they said. They're doing it with other towns, with building inspectors and planning, and that the larger town is able to hire the person. They're trying to make it work where they hire a person out on a regional basis, but they're finding what's more successful right now is one town take the lead, and then they're able to share those services with
So
other
more
towns.
coordinated shared services than actual traditional shared services in
Right.
some ways.
I think we could do that here with this position, and maybe Park and Rec could also be something we share with Middlebury.
I think we
So
have
it's kind of, Mike, to your point, with a little bit of a different twist.
I think we have a unique opportunity in that the two towns to our northwest are Bridgewater and Roxbury. You add those two towns, you add only 5,000 people and 4 commercial buildings. And I think that's something that should be explored.
And it's it's easier to explore that within your
I'm
town.
not saying go to Newtown, under any circumstances. We don't need to, you know, court somebody that's larger than us, or 2 towns away, but I just think that's a unique opportunity. They certainly can't do it for themselves, and they're right
The
there.
discussions that happened, just to your point, the discussions that happened were like Bristol, and, you know, they have a bigger group of people, and yet they have some smaller towns around them, so they're able to help share that out.
And we do have Woodbury, and of course Oxford is, you know,
Surrounded by smaller towns, except for Newtown, obviously.
I don't know if Oxford's smaller.
Yeah, it is.
It is, yeah.
But they have a lot more commercial
The
property, they have a lot
idea-
more
the idea being
development.
that, you know, they would have their own people to staff their own
And I think that,
we can, you know, help them to do.
I think that the tornado that we had, and then look back at the other weather events that we had, then as we have a professional who obviously it'd be hard to get somebody at that level, and you begin to understand more about what emergency management is really about, is the planning. And as was expressed to me, you know, you still have potential of chemical spills and issues in the schools or the high school that are more apt to have happen than other incidents. We have, you know, 84 up here, and we also have, you know, a number of other things besides weather events. And I think that some of the other municipalities, those who had felt the full impact of that tornado, and frankly, again, what was the largest natural disaster to hit since 1955. If they had experienced that, some of these, I sadly think a lot of municipalities, and I'm not saying ours, but I think some municipalities look at this not as important as they might think. You know, you're designating someone to be the emergency management director. They have a couple meetings, and that's where we were at. And there was, you know, a police officer who was emergency management designated. We met the criteria that you were designating. And I think it's bigger than that. I think that's the experience we've had. I would love to regionalize or share services. And I think we're still in the COG and the share services area. It's still in the beginning stages of that. So that's why I brought this forward with this budget. Anybody else?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the budget pending some additional information on Parks and Recs as that dives out to be put into infrastructure.